Spokane, Washington, early October. The morning wind carried the scent of cold pine and old copper. Dry leaves danced across the cracked sidewalk in front of Briggs' house, a modest single story with a sagging porch, where the American flag still waved, slightly faded but never lowered. Walter Briggs stood on that porch now, glancing at the watch that had been with him since Saigon. It was exactly 8:40 a.m. He ran a hand over the front of his cleanest flannel shirt, checked the shine on his boots, and stepped down the creaking steps with quiet resolve. His neighbor Frank was already waiting in his pickup, engine humming, a coffee cup balanced on the dash. "You ready, Walt?" Walter nodded. "Took me 12 years to save for this. I'm not about to be late." They didn't talk much on the drive. Two men from a generation where silence wasn't awkward. It was respectful. The sun broke through the thinning clouds as they passed through town. The hardware store, the VFW post, and the bakery where Walter had once fixed the owner's old radio in exchange for fresh rye bread. At 9:03, they arrived at North Pine Motors. Glass, chrome, and banners. Shiny sedans and lifted trucks lined up like soldiers in perfect formation. Walter stepped out slowly. He adjusted his Veterans of Foreign Wars cap, more out of habit than pride, and gave Frank a nod. "I won't be long." Frank smiled. "Take your time, brother." Walter entered the showroom alone. The inside was colder than the weather outside. Polished tile floors that reflected fluorescent lights. Walls lined with posters showing smiling families beside shiny new SUVs. 5 salesmen in fitted suits clustered near the back desk, laughing at something on one of their phones. None of them looked up. He walked past the welcome desk, unmanned, and headed toward a corner seat near the complimentary coffee station. He poured himself half a cup and sat quietly, watching the showroom move around him like a world he no longer belonged to. At first, he didn't mind. He'd spent most of his life waiting, for coordinates, for clearance, for silence between mortar shells. A little patience was nothing new. But 10 minutes became 20, then 40. Still no one approached. One young salesman passed him twice, brushing close enough to smell of cologne and ambition. Walter offered a small, polite smile, the kind soldiers use when unsure of their welcome. The young man didn't return it. Walter turned his eyes toward a silver Tacoma parked near the entrance. The model was clean, reliable, just enough room for groceries, gear, and maybe a grandson, if he ever visited. That's when the receptionist appeared. She was in her 20s, sharp suit, sharper voice. "This lounge is for real customers, sir," she said, her tone clipped, her eyes not quite meeting his. Walter looked up, startled more by the word "sir" than her tone. "I'm here to buy a truck," he said softly. She scanned his flannel shirt, his jeans, his posture. Not threatening, just out of place. "Someone will be with you eventually," she replied. The word eventually hung in the air like dust. He nodded once, adjusted the folded piece of paper in his breast pocket, handwritten specs and mileage notes, and returned to his seat. But something inside him shifted. Behind the glass of the manager's office, a group of salesmen chuckled. "That guy's been here forever," one muttered. "Probably just wants free coffee and a warm seat," another added. "Bet he doesn't even have a license anymore," a third snorted. The receptionist joined them. He wandered in. These types do sometimes. Their laughter was low, but it cut deep, the way some wounds don't bleed, just bruise beneath the surface. Walter heard it all. He didn't move, just folded his hands over his knee. His left thumb traced the corner of an old photograph in his wallet, a black and white image of 6 young men in jungle fatigues standing beside a weather-beaten antenna array. Their faces were dirt-smudged, tired, alive. The man in the center had his arm around Walter's shoulder. LT, Raymond Hale, now a name on defense contracts, but once a young officer whose life had depended on Walter's calm voice under enemy fire. Walter didn't look like much now, but there was a time when holding a radio steady in a thunderstorm of bullets was the difference between coming home and becoming a folded flag. He'd never needed anyone to thank him, but he never thought he'd become invisible. Outside, through the showroom windows, a black SUV pulled into the lot. It moved like it belonged. The doors opened, and a man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out, tall, composed, with a bearing that years of boardrooms hadn't erased. His gaze swept the lot with surgical focus before locking onto the figure inside the showroom, sitting quietly in a worn flannel shirt near the coffee machine. The man entered. The salesman turned at the sudden shift in energy, as if the air had stiffened into attention. He didn't speak until he reached the center of the floor. Then, with a voice that carried like it had across a field command tent in 1968, he said, "Sergeant Walter Briggs?" The room froze. Walter stood slowly. The flannel shirt looked suddenly like a uniform. The decades seemed to fall away in a moment that felt holy. Raymond Hale crossed the floor in long strides and embraced him. "You're a hard man to find," he said, eyes bright but voice steady. The receptionist paled. The manager stood. Salesmen straightened their collars. Greg, the youngest of them, blinked in disbelief. "You know him?" the receptionist stammered. "Know him?" Hale turned to her, his tone steel. "This man saved my life. Twice." He turned to the staff. "And you let him sit here for nearly an hour." No one answered, because there was no answer that would do. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Hale made one call. Short, direct, a few words, and when he hung up, the world would not return to the way it had been. Walter Briggs had been dismissed, but the room, and the world watching it, was about to remember him again. The hush that followed Colonel Raymond Hale's entrance didn't come from awe. It came from recognition, the kind that peels away the noise of a showroom and leaves only truth standing. Walter Briggs had not moved. Not really, but somehow he seemed taller now. The quiet man by the coffee station had straightened, as though decades of silence had been lifted from his spine with a single word: Sergeant. Hale closed the distance with steady, commanding steps. There was no hesitation, no need to ask permission. His arms wrapped around Walter like they'd never left the battlefield. "I looked for you for years," Hale said, his voice low, but every word deliberate. "But you've always been hard to find." Walter's lips parted, but for a moment, nothing came out. Then he simply said, "You made it home." Hale smiled. "Because of you." The rest of the showroom had fallen into a surreal paralysis. The receptionist, the same one who had told Walter the lounge was for real customers, stood rigid behind her counter, her eyes darting between the two men. The manager emerged from his office, tie askew, face paling with each second. The young salesman Greg lingered at a distance, visibly stunned, a clipboard still clutched in his hand like a relic from another world. And then Hale turned, slowly, intentionally. His voice did not rise in anger. It didn't need to. "Do you know who this man is?" he asked, eyes fixed on the manager. "Sir, we didn't know he was a veteran," the manager stammered. "But you didn't ask," Hale replied evenly. "You saw flannel, old boots, and gray hair, and you assumed that meant he didn't matter." He took a slow breath. His gaze swept the floor, pausing on each face, every suit, every silenced chuckle that still hung in the air. "This man," he said, pointing gently toward Walter, "carried our entire platoon's comms through 6 days of mud, blood, and rain and louse. When we were ambushed, he stayed calm. When my radio jammed, he rigged a makeshift antenna out of a belt buckle and a bullet casing. That transmission saved my life. And 37 others." He paused, let the weight settle. 3 weeks later, when I was shot, this man dragged me half a mile through jungle under fire with a bullet in his own shoulder. He didn't wait for thanks then, and he hasn't asked for it since. Silence thickened like fog. The manager could only whisper, "We're sorry." Hale nodded once. "Good," he said. "Then you'll understand why I'm buying this dealership." The sentence landed like a detonated mine. The staff blinked. A murmur ran through the air like static. The manager blinked rapidly. "You what?" "I just got off the phone with your holding group," Hale said, lifting his cell slightly. "As of 20 minutes from now, I will own controlling interest in this business. Don't worry, your jobs are safe. For now. But why would you?" "Because some debts can't be paid in words," Hale said simply. "But they can be honored." He turned back to Walter. "I didn't come here looking for you," he said. "But I thank God I found you before the rest of the world forgot." Walter's voice was quiet. "Raymond, I didn't come here for attention. I just needed a truck. Something simple. Hale smiled, but it wasn't patronizing. It was the smile of a man who had once survived a war under the hum of that voice. You'll have one, he said. Any vehicle here. Yours. No forms. No waiting. Walter shook his head slowly. Ray, that's not necessary. It is to me, Hale cut in gently. It is to every man who made it home because of you. He turned to the stunned staff. And as for the rest of you, starting tomorrow, you'll be retrained. Every single employee, in veteran etiquette, in dignity, in how to see people. And if you can't learn to treat every soul who walks through that door with respect, you'll walk right back out of it. The atmosphere began to shift. Greg, the young salesman who had questioned the treatment from the start, stepped forward. He removed his lanyard badge, looked Hale in the eye. Sir, if it's all right, I'd like to help Mr. Briggs choose a truck. Personally. Walter looked at him for a moment. The lines in his face creased into something that almost looked like forgiveness. Let's walk the lot, Walter said, voice steady. The two men moved slowly toward the row of used trucks outside. The sun broke gently through the clouds. The flag above the dealership fluttered against a perfect blue sky. Inside, the remaining staff stood in stunned silence. Some looked ashamed. Others changed. 20 minutes later, Walter and Greg returned. They had chosen a charcoal gray F-150, gently used but well kept. Reliable. Strong. Like its new owner. Solid choice, Hale said, his arms crossed with quiet pride. Walter nodded. It'll do. Greg stepped back. Sir, if there's anything else. There is, Hale said, turning again to the receptionist. A question. She looked up, startled. When you saw him sitting there earlier, Hale asked, what did you see? She swallowed hard. An old man. Waiting. He waited. I didn't see what I should have seen, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. And what was that? A veteran. A protector. A man with more to teach than we gave him credit for. Hale nodded. Then maybe you're ready to start learning. As Hale and Walter stood together outside, the sign above the dealership gleamed in late morning sunlight. A worker had already begun removing the old logo. The new one would go up the next day. Briggs and Hale Motors, built on brotherhood. Beneath it, etched into brushed steel on the front wall, another line was being installed. A quote Walter had scribbled in the margins of his notebook years ago. No voice unheard. No service forgotten. Walter stood in the same spot he had waited in silently just an hour earlier. Only now, the entire dealership had gathered around him. They didn't speak. They just watched, learning in silence what Hale had known all along. That some men never stop serving, even when the world stops noticing. The next morning broke over Spokane with a quiet clarity. Pale sun brushing the treetops, birds calling gently between the rooftops. The flag in front of Briggs and Hale Motors caught the first light, fluttering not just in breeze, but in purpose. Walter Briggs stood at the end of the sidewalk, one hand on his cane, the other resting on the smooth steel of the new F-150 parked beside him. His truck now. Clean. Reliable. Just what he had come for. And so much more. He took a breath before stepping inside, uncertain what he'd find beyond the glass. The door opened with a soft chime. But unlike yesterday, when that sound was ignored, today it was answered. Every staff member stood, not in forced ceremony, not in orchestrated display. They stood because something had shifted in the atmosphere in themselves. The showroom floor, which once felt like a cold, indifferent stage, now held warmth. The silence wasn't empty. It was reverent. Greg stepped forward, not in uniform, not in sales pitch mode. Just a young man, humbled, changed. Morning, Mr. Briggs, he said. We've been expecting you. Walter gave a modest nod, gaze sweeping the room. No smugness. No need to linger on anyone's discomfort. Just the quiet dignity of a man whose worth was finally being honored, not explained. You picked the right tires, he said with a dry smile, tapping the side of the truck. Won't slide come winter. Greg grinned. Checked twice. Had them rotated this morning. From behind the counter, the receptionist, now dressed in simpler attire, her hair tied back without flourish, stepped forward. She didn't say much, just handed Walter a sealed envelope with his name on it, and met his eyes. "No paperwork," she said. "Just a thank you." Walter took the envelope, nodded once, then added gently, "It's never too late to look someone in the eye." Her lips parted, perhaps to apologize, or maybe just to breathe, but the moment had already done the talking. As Walter turned to walk the lot one more time, something caught his eye above the entrance. Workers were just finishing the final bolt on the new signage. Chrome letters gleamed in the morning light. Briggs and Hale Motors, built on brotherhood. His name, not for vanity, but for a story that might outlive him. He stood still beneath it, one hand on his chest. He didn't smile. He just looked up, letting the moment imprint on something deeper than memory. Greg walked beside him. "I know it's not your style, sir," he said, glancing upward, "but we thought it might help folks remember." Walter replied, quietly, "It's not about remembering me. It's about remembering to look again." Back inside, a new plaque had been mounted behind the front desk. Simple, dark bronze, with raised serif letters. "Every voice matters. Every service remembered." Walter approached it slowly, eyes scanning each word as though they were a coded message only he could fully understand. He reached into his wallet and pulled out the old black and white photo. 6 men in fatigues, one of them with a hand on his shoulder. He tucked the photo behind the plaque's base. A private offering, unseen but eternal. "Wouldn't be here without them," he murmured. As the morning passed, the dealership began to fill. But this time, it wasn't only customers looking for cars. A young woman in a navy jacket approached Walter with a hesitant smile. "My dad served in Nam too," she said. "He always talked about guys like you. Men who got things done, quietly." Walter looked at her jacket, saw the faded unit patch, and nodded once. "He ever talk about the radios?" She laughed, said the guy with the radio was the most important man on the field. Walter gave a small shrug. "We just made sure people didn't get lost." She blinked. "Well, thanks to you, some of them came home." At noon, Colonel Raymond Hale returned, not in a suit this time, but in a navy blue polo and jeans, blending into the room like he'd always belonged there. He walked straight to Walter and shook his hand again, but this time it was different, less formal, more personal. "They put the sign up," he said. "I saw," Walter replied. "Still feels strange." Hale gestured toward the lot. "We've had 8 veteran customers walk in this morning. Not for deals, just to say thank you." Walter sat down in one of the leather chairs, the very same lounge where he had once been told he didn't belong. Now it was his. As the hours passed, the mood around the dealership transformed. Coffee was offered. Names were exchanged. No one sat alone. No one walked past without acknowledgement. Walter stayed until late afternoon. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't inspecting vehicles. He was just there, a living reminder of what it looked like to serve, to forgive, and to return with quiet strength. Before he left, Greg approached one last time. "Mr. Briggs, if you don't mind me asking." He hesitated, respectful. "Why didn't you walk out yesterday?" Walter paused. Then he looked the young man in the eye. "Because walking away doesn't teach anything. But waiting? Waiting makes the right people notice." That evening, just before the sun dipped behind the horizon, Walter drove his new truck down Maple Avenue. The world looked the same. Same cracked sidewalks, same kids on bicycles, same rustling leaves. But something in him felt different. Not bigger, just seen. When he pulled into his driveway, he sat there for a while, engine running low, the radio softly playing a ballad from the 1970s, one that hadn't sounded like much until now. He reached into the glove box, pulled out the sealed envelope the receptionist had given him. Thank you notes from families who had long been looking for someone to hear their stories. A new coffee table held a notebook titled "Voices We Should Have Heard Sooner." Walter read from it every morning. Veterans from all eras began to arrive. Some came in wheelchairs, others with service dogs. A few wore jackets still bearing the desert dust of newer wars. They brought medals they never talked about and traumas they had tucked away for decades. They didn't come for the discounts, though the dealership quietly offered them. They came for recognition, the simple kind, the kind that isn't grand or loud. A handshake, a steady eye, a seat that wasn't treated like a mistake. They came because someone, a quiet man in flannel with a soldier's bearing, had been seen, and in that moment they saw themselves. One afternoon, a woman named Teresa arrived, clutching a photo album and a worn dog tag. Her father had served in Vietnam. He never spoke about it. Not to her, not to anyone. He passed away with more stories locked inside him than she would ever know. She placed the tag on the front desk and said to Greg, "I read about Walter. My dad would have wanted to meet him." Greg nodded, walked her straight to the lounge, and called for Walter. They talked for hours. When she left, she wrote a single sentence on the back of a dealership brochure and left it beside the coffee pot. "Thank you for showing the world that quiet men still matter." Hale returned to Spokane every few weeks, though he never made an entrance like that first one. He sat with Walter on the bench, just outside the front doors, watching customers and veterans come and go. Sometimes they didn't speak at all, just sat shoulder to shoulder like they had in younger years, scanning the horizon for something that didn't need a name. "Funny," Hale said once, sipping his coffee. "I thought I was here to give you something." Walter chuckled. "Looks like you ended up building something." Hale nodded slowly. "I didn't. We did." With the dealership's growth came community events. Not flashy, just purposeful. On the first Saturday of every month, Veterans Voice Night invited local vets to share stories around a fire pit behind the dealership. Some spoke. Others just listened. No one was forced to explain why they came. Local schools began bringing students in for tours. They sat quietly while Walter talked about Morse code and radio relays and what it meant to be steady when others couldn't be. And once a quarter, a new veteran was invited to etch their initials into the bronze plaque near the front entrance. Beneath the permanent line, "Every voice matters. Every service remembered." Greg was in charge of overseeing all of it. The young man who once watched silently as Walter was ignored now ran the dealership's Veterans Outreach program with precision, humility, and, most importantly, attention. Walter never let it become about him. He showed up every morning at 7:45, poured 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for the empty seat beside him, and read the daily entries from the visitor log. Some were short. "SGT. Anthony W. 10th Mountain. You made me feel visible again." Others carried grief. "My brother never came home. Thank you for honoring the ones who did." But every word Walter read, carefully, silently, like they were coordinates in a mission that never quite ended. By winter, national news outlets began to call. Walter declined every interview. "They're not here to meet a story," he told Hale. "They're here to meet themselves." But he agreed to one thing: the dealership's new commercial, which aired quietly during a regional football game. It featured no actors, no slogans, just a single camera shot of Walter sitting on the bench, the news sign gleaming above him. He looked straight into the lens and said, "We don't ask for thanks. We ask to be seen. And if we're seen, we'll show up." Every time, the screen faded to black. The hashtag appeared, #no voice unheard. In the weeks that followed, letters came by the dozen. From Alaska, from Tennessee, from families with no living veterans, just memories and unasked questions. Walter read every one. Some he responded to. Others he simply folded, pressed to his heart, and placed in the drawer beside the old black and white photo of 6 men in the jungle. The drawer was almost full now. One cold December morning, Greg approached Walter with something in his hand, a key, engraved and worn at the edges. "What's this?" Walter asked. Greg smiled. "The spare key to the dealership. Not because you work here, but because you helped build what it became." Walter took it slowly, ran a thumb along the edge, and placed it in his pocket next to the dog tag he still carried. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. His silence, once mistaken for weakness, now echoed louder than applause. A year had passed. The seasons in Spokane had turned and turned again, from a first snowfall that settled gently on the roof of Briggs and Hale Motors, to the bloom of spring that returned stubbornly along the sidewalk cracks, to the dry heat of summer, and back again to the rusted leaves of fall. Inside the dealership, nothing had been the same since Walter Briggs stopped being invisible. And yet, the man himself hadn't changed. Every morning, Walter arrived at 7:45. Same flannel shirt, same soft footfalls, same old leather thermos tucked under one arm. He'd unlocked the front door with the key Greg had given him, not as an employee, but as a steward. He no longer sat by the coffee machine. He now sat at the honor table, a simple wooden table near the front of the showroom, flanked by two sturdy chairs and a small bronze plate that read, "Reserved for those who never stopped serving." It was the same seat where, over a year ago, he had once waited and been overlooked. The memory of that moment didn't haunt him, but it anchored him, not in bitterness, in purpose. He didn't sell vehicles. He didn't answer phones. He didn't wear a badge, but he helped 3 young veterans file for their VA benefits that week. He fixed a retired Navy officer's busted ham radio the week before. And just yesterday, he listened to a young woman from Fort Lewis cry for 27 minutes straight before saying a single word. He listened to every second, because that's what you do when someone finally finds the courage to speak. Greg had changed too. Once just a junior salesman with a conscience, he was now director of veteran services and training. His job wasn't just to teach others how to sell. It was to ensure that every employee understood what it meant to see. He walked the floor like someone who knew what each corner of the building used to mean and what it had come to mean. He made coffee differently now. 1 scoop extra, 2 creams, no sugar, just like Walter took it. And when new hires joined the team, their first day always began at the honor table. "Meet Mr. Briggs," he'd say. "He won't tell you how to sell a car. But if you listen, really listen, he'll teach you how to show up." The sign outside gleamed brighter after they polished it, once a week, like a ritual. Briggs and Hale Motors, built on brotherhood. And just beneath it, etched in brass, the motto that had started it all. Some heroes never stopped serving. Local news had long since stopped running stories. National interest had moved on. But inside the dealership, the movement never faded, because it had become culture. They didn't call it veteran-friendly. They didn't hand out brochures that bragged about discounts or outreach programs. They just lived it. One Wednesday morning, a man named Everett came in, 92 years old, Army Air Corps, Battle of the Bulge. He didn't want to talk at first. Just sat at the honor table and stared out the window. Walter brought him coffee without asking. 10 minutes passed before Everett finally said, "You know, I haven't walked into a place with my head up in a long time." Walter nodded. "Takes time." Everett looked down at the coffee. "Yeah, but you made it possible." He tapped the table softly. "This," he said, "isn't furniture. It's memory, carved in wood." Walter said nothing. He just refilled Everett's cup. That winter, a letter arrived from a high school 3 towns over. The students had heard about the dealership, about Walter, about the stories. They wanted to visit, not to tour, but to learn. So they came. A group of 15 juniors and seniors. One boy whose grandfather had served in Korea. Another who was thinking about joining the Navy. They sat in folding chairs around the honor table, while Walter spoke softly about service, quiet leadership, and the radio that had once refused to die, even under fire. "People talk a lot about heroism," Walter said, "but they forget that sometimes it's not the one who charges forward. Sometimes it's the one who holds a line, who doesn't panic when a wire goes dead." At the end of the visit, the students left thank you notes. One said, "I never met my grandpa, but I think he was like you." Walter folded that note and tucked it into his wallet. Right next to the photo, 6 men in jungle uniforms. One of them smiling, hand on Walter's shoulder. Colonel Hale visited less now. His company growing, demands mounting. But when he did return, he always sat with Walter outside on the bench. The same old rhythm between them. One day, as they watched a young couple test drive a hybrid sedan, Hale said, "I used to think command was about decisions." Walter gave him a side glance. Hale shrugged. "Turns out it's about presence." Walter looked out at the parking lot. "Turns out everything is." They sat in silence. No need to prove anything. No need to explain what had changed. It was all around them. The last entry in the logbook that month read, "I came for a car. I left with my name spoken like it mattered. Thank you." On a gray Friday afternoon in early spring, Walter didn't come. In. Greg noticed first. The keys hadn't been turned in. No coffee made. He called Walter's house. No answer. He drove over, found the front door unlocked. Walter was sitting in his chair by the window, hat in his lap, eyes closed. Peaceful, as if he had simply taken a breath and decided not to let it out. On the small table beside him was the note from the high school student, the photo from Vietnam, and a folded American flag. Not the one from casket, but one Walter kept tucked inside a drawer for safekeeping. Greg sat beside him in the quiet for a long while. The dealership closed for a day, not because it had to, but because he had earned that much. The ceremony was simple. The flag flew at half-mast. A single empty chair sat at the honor table, a flannel shirt draped across the back. A cup of coffee rested beside it. No speeches, no marketing, just stillness. And behind the front desk, a new plaque was installed, next to the one Walter had read so many times. This one was for him. Walter Briggs. He waited, and the world learned to see again. The story of Walter Briggs offers a timeless lesson about dignity, recognition, and the quiet strength of those who serve without asking for attention. In today's fast-paced, appearance-driven society, it is all too easy to overlook the elderly, the modest, or those who do not demand to be noticed. Walter's experience, being dismissed by car dealership staff based solely on his appearance, only to later become a symbol of honor and transformation, speaks to a broader truth. The worth of a person is not found in what they wear or how loudly they speak, but in the lives they've touched, often in silence. This narrative mirrors countless real-life situations where veterans, elders, or individuals of quiet service are bypassed in favor of those who seem more important by modern standards. Walter, like many unsung heroes, did not respond to disrespect with outrage or revenge. Instead, he remained calm, anchored by a lifetime of resilience. When recognition came, it wasn't because he demanded it. It was because someone finally chose to look deeper. The ripple effect of Walter's story is a reminder that small moments of justice can lead to large-scale change. When one act of acknowledgement spreads through a business, a community, or even social media, it can spark reflection across generations. Walter's transformation from an invisible customer to a respected mentor created a movement not built on marketing campaigns or public praise, but on restored human decency. His story serves as a guidepost in workplaces, schools, and everyday interactions. It urges people to slow down, to notice the overlooked, and to treat every individual with dignity, not because of what they can offer, but because of who they are. Businesses, in particular, can learn from this. Culture isn't shaped by slogans, but by how the quietest person in the room is treated. Ultimately, Walter Briggs represents a legacy far greater than one man. He symbolizes the power of stillness, the courage of patience, and the profound impact of simply being seen. In a society that often rewards volume over values, his story stands as a reminder that some of the greatest contributions come from those who never stopped serving, even after the world stopped watching.